as I promised, these species are going to do pretty, I think they're going to do great. So here's our snow brush. I think I have a picture of bitterbrush. It actually gets top killed and doesn't come back as well, but some might argue that we had a little more bitterbrush than we needed in a lot of the shrub steppe. Rose, bunchgrass, and then we have elderberry. All these photos I took in the fall, and I was just pretty impressed with, even in the fall, we had a pretty moist one, how many plants were actually already resprouting. And it took the time here. Great. All right, another one of our success stories, I think, will be a lot of our draws of aspen. So I imagine several of you took walks in different areas where you saw the aspen recruiting quite well. Yeah? Just a few things about aspen. So much like the other endurers that we've discussed, even light surface fires will top kill aspens. They have really thin bark. However, they have lateral roots that can actually sprout up and do sprout really vigorously after fire. Pretty interesting. They have this hormone switch, basically. I don't understand all the chemistry for sure. But with the top killing and exposed mineral soil, aspen have this trigger to start sprouting. And we're seeing that in a lot of post-fire landscapes where there's just enormous sprouting of aspen. I would say that one of the only kind of worrisome things is how heavily some of the areas are getting hit by deer. So a lot of the bitterbrush, a lot of the shrub steppe range for deer have been compromised by the fires. And one of the questions is how much aspen browse will happen in the next couple years. In the case of browse, aspen won't be killed, it will just be coppiced, which means that it would keep on being browsed down to the level that deer could get. So hopefully a lot of them will actually shoot up and be beyond the deer's reach at that point. This is just a photo taken actually from southern Utah, and it's just another example of what an endurer aspen is. We took a hike through the Grand Gulch area, and on the way out I was really surprised to see aspen there. It's such a dry desert country, and I asked about that at the interpretive center, and the ranger said, I'm glad you asked about that. We think that those aspens actually established, those individuals established after the Ice Age, or right around the Ice Age, and that individual plant has continued to persist by sprouting. So that was their story. Okay, a little bit on invaders. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of our weeds are invader species. With the endurers, I haven't spent a lot of time on the bunchgrass, but I think it's good to contrast areas that have a lot of native bunchgrasses versus areas that are starting over, have mineral soil. So the bunchgrass has just had kind of an ideal fire. So I know that I mentioned how severe, how intense the Carlton complex fire was, but it happened mostly in one day. And the residence time in the shrub steppe was minimal. The fire whipped through there, didn't last, there were not a lot of coarse wood to have the soils get cooked. And so a lot of the bunchgrass and other shrub steppe are just going to sprout right back and actually have a lot of nutrients now available from the fire to access, and a reduction of competitors such as bitterbrush. So they'll do quite well. However, areas that have now a huge expanse of mineral soil and not a lot of plants rooted in are very vulnerable to some of our worst non-natives. So the ones that worry me are cheatgrass and bulbous bluegrass for sure, tumbling mustard. We can go on for a while, but we won't. And then the other concern that I have is a little bit about post-fire management. I know that there was a lot of effort locally to get local seed, which is good, and hopefully to have it be pure, really pure. Unfortunately, in other areas that have been seeded with native bunchgrass, there's been quite a bit of contamination by cheatgrass. And I know that in the rodeo Chetasky fires, no, it was actually a different one, sorry, it was in Arizona though. that people estimated that over 1 billion cheatgrass seeds were seeded into their landscape through, really well-intentioned seeding programs. But that is a concern about contamination. How much are we actually dispersing non-native seeds along with the natives? Another question is, if we get our seed from outside of the valley, even Yakima, we might introduce some weeds that we don't have right now, such as yellow star thistle. So, invaders, not all bad, but some of them are. Here's just a couple of photos to remind us that many invaders do good work, although this is non-native right here. I tried to get a photo of the lupin without me, but I couldn't find one. But yeah, lupin, I'm sure many of you know, actually plays a role in actually fixing nitrogen and is a great first start for regenerating landscapes. Okay, as I promised, I'm going to close my talk with just a few thoughts about fire and climate change. Dovetails a bit with Paul Hesberg. Our colleague Jeremy Littell looked at this whole bioregion of basically Washington across, I think this is mostly Washington here, Western, and then Cascade Crest here. And what he was looking at is fire frequency in periods where we had a lot of available water in the soils and vegetation. Those would be low fire years here, and the color is blue. And areas and years where we were vulnerable to fire, meaning that we had water deficit in our landscape, and that was highly correlated to high fire years. Another way of saying that is oftentimes our big fires are synchronized. We have regional fire years because we're set up through early snow melt of snowpack or dry summer conditions to be vulnerable to large fires. And so with climate change, we unfortunately are going to have more of these seasons. We're going to have longer fire seasons and be more set up for regional fire events. So one of the things that as ecologists we're thinking about is ways to make our landscapes more resilient to fire. We're going to have more of them. We're also going to have warmer temperatures that are going to further challenge plants in regenerating following the fire and surviving under a warmer regime. And one of the main things that we can do is bring back some of the structures in the landscape that make them more resilient. I just thought that this was worth repeating, that mosaics across landscapes that break up the pattern of fuels, as Paul said last week, are really important to bring in resiliency on this scale. And then over here on the left, the more that we have more open conditions in our forests, especially in the low elevation ponderosa pine and Douglas fir forests, the more likely they're going to survive fires. That said, sometimes we'll get a Carlton complex fire, and maybe our treatments won't work. But we need to probably think about hedging our bets and having more of our landscapes look like this and be more adapted to fire. In closing, I think our valley has this really great symbol in so many ways. You know, the Mehmel peoples named themselves after the arrowleaf balsam root, and it happens to be one of the best endurers I know. This plant has tap roots that just go down forever. Along road cuts, you can actually see arrowleaf balsam root roots about 7 to 9 feet down. Why it does not transplant well. So once this plant gets established, it has really deep roots, and you bet it can survive fire. I was excited to actually get this photo. I know that the Mehmel Conservancy captured a couple too, but balsam root occasionally after the Carlton complex fire took time to bloom. So this was a late summer bloom following the Carlton complex fire. And I'm going to close by saying that yes, climate change is a little daunting, and I know that we're going to have some other big fires in this valley. I think that this time following the Carlton complex really gives us an opportunity to take stock of what we have and what we need to do. And balsam root for me is really perhaps emblematic of that. And so some of the characteristics that I really appreciate about that plant is that it is deeply rooted. So is our community. It's built to last. I think that we can really take some characteristics of the balsam root, make sure that our properties are resilient to fire, built to last. One of the main things we can do in the Forest Service lands and state lands and also on our properties is become more fire adapted. So plants in our ecosystems are not only fire adapted, they're fire dependent. And I think increasingly we might want to think of ourselves as too, but we need to have the right kind of fire, not necessarily the big stair-facing Carlton complex things. And then finally, what's really neat about all of these things, about the balsam root sunflower and about us, is that we live in a really beautiful place. And in doing these things, we make it even more beautiful.
I just have a question about a particular area. We took a hike up, I think, the Andrews Creek Trail to Mehmel Lake.
Oh, yes. That was from the farewell fire.
And you can go miles, and there's no conifers. And then finally you start seeing some conifers coming up. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about why it's taking so long for conifers to regenerate in the early part of that trail.
That's a long time ago because that was 2003. I'm actually surprised. So the forest in that area, it starts out with Douglas fir, right? A lot of Douglas fir, and you're not seeing Doug fir regeneration.
I'm seeing, gray tree trunks and fireweed.
And fireweed.
For miles.
Okay. So, I want to go out there with you because I was told that after the tripod fire, some of the soils were sterilized and that we're going to have regeneration failures because there was this huge swaths of, high severity fire. And then I took some colleagues out and I was like, let's look beyond the fireweed. Let's start hunting around. There's lodgepole pine everywhere, and there was also a lot of aspen regenerating. So I wonder if you got off the trail and started looking, because I'd be actually surprised if there wasn't more than. It's just going to be slow. We live in a really kind of we have short growing seasons here, and so the revegetation is going to take a while.
Yeah, leading up to this Carlton complex fire, and leading up going back two years, we had two really wet winters and springs and summers. And then last winter, and that made a lot of grass grow.
I'm so glad you asked that question. Yep.
And then the last winter, we didn't have any snow really until February, and in the shrub steppe we basically had none. And so the grass never got smushed down. So we had 2 years of really good grass growth, and those smushing down last year to flatten it. And so it was still standing when that fire came through. And how does that seems like an outlier to me, part of that outlier story.
Absolutely. I've talked about that a lot with colleagues. I agree. And so I'm going to just say that in the southwestern United States, large fire events are triggered by a previous growing season of abnormally wet conditions. And so the wet growing, the monsoons, produce a lot of standing grass that then the next year carries large fires. And I've actually looked at the weather records. We had the wettest September, I think, on record, the September before the Carlton complex fires. And the wildflowers were outrageously good. I mean, we had more balsam fruit, more shrub steppe blooming than I've ever seen, but we also had greener hillsides than I've ever seen too. And I think that, we did have a lot of standing biomass that contributed to the spread. I agree. Yes?
Yeah, I was wondering, could you comment on the negatives of salvage farming?
You bet, because I've been recently schooled on this issue, and I like to be wrong, and because it makes me, not always, Julie can definitely attest to it, I don't always like to be wrong, but in terms of the salvage logging, I've always really hesitated about it because of impacts to soil. And so, a couple things. I think that Connie can answer this question, and I will defer to her about the actual usefulness when it comes to beetle outbreaks and preventing those. So I will just punt that one, so it's there. But in terms of actually cost-benefit analysis, I know that in the tripod, trucking costs and also the fact that the wood became quickly unmerchantable made it not really financially great investment to go in. And then there are the negatives of roads and soil impacts if you salvage not on snow. So I say that, and then I mean another thing that I've always said is that a dead tree is often worth more than a living tree to wildlife. Now, what I got schooled about by Richie Herod, who's going to come give you a talk soon, was this reburn potential. And so what they were seeing in Lake Chelan area is that fires that occurred right around 1994 in the 90s have been reburning recently. And what that means for those landscapes is that ponderosa pine, Doug fir started to regenerate. It's kind of in the seedling, sapling stage of succession, and is surrounded by all these trees that have fallen down in different configurations, much like a horrific campfire in all directions. And so the reburn is not just the fine fuels, it's also the coarse wood, and it burns for a long time, cooks that regeneration, and then there's no more seed left. And so those areas are reverting to grassland where they, would have been forest. And so that's the consideration they're thinking, that if they could responsibly salvage some areas, they might reduce that reburn potential. Yes, Alexa.
How did the area down near Carlton, the old burn there, I think it was 2002 or just south of Libby Creek?
Right.
How did that fare as far as like burning more and killing off? I haven't walked up there.
So I think you were talking about the Libby Creek fire, right?
It was before, I think it was
South
right
Libby.
before I think it was
South,
there.
thank you, South Libby. It reburnt, and the grass has actually carried it all the way through that fire. We didn't see that in the tripod. There's not as many grasses in the landscape, and the southern edge of the tripod was the only area that was actively managed, meaning that there wasn't direct defense on that line because people really felt like it was not going to do anything in the tripod. However, there were other areas like the Chilloist and South Libby that reburned because of the grass cover.
I know that the fire went through there again, but was it hot enough or was it just quick and burning through the grasses that did it ignite the old standing dead trees and then?
I don't know the answer to that. Do you, John?
Well, I don't know, but the trees that were there, the seedlings.
The seedlings
a
wouldn't
grass
survive
fire
it.
would probably be sufficient to kill the trees. That was what, 2001?
Yeah, that's what
So you probably look at seedling saplings.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have been fire resistant.
Yeah. Yes, Heidi.
I know I went out with you and walked around and looked at riparian areas before the fire, and we talked a lot about like their susceptibility, and sort of what they represented, in terms of the fire risk. And then, after the fire, spending a lot of time on our conservation easements and stuff, I don't know if this is representative of the whole landscape, but it definitely, those areas got hit really hard.
They did. There was a lot of dead material in those riparian areas. Yeah.
And so would you attribute that again to the specific characteristics of the Carlton complex and the speed it went through and the way it did things? I mean, they're definitely coming back quickly because they've got those species in them that will resprout quickly and that kind of thing, but I'm just also curious, from a management perspective, is there anything differently that people should think about, or is that just...
This is partly opinion, and I've shared this one with you too. I think that riparian areas are, quote, supposed to be messy. That's the best habitat if they're messy and there's coarse wood and there's, the aspens coming up, and aspens are not very long-lived, willow's not very long-lived, and so there will be that component that's messy and likely to burn. However, there's also some interesting questions about could we actually start more prescribed burns if we were allowed to at the edge of riparian areas and take care of some of that wood. Right now they're boom bust, you know, and I was actually pretty pleased to see how much sprouting we had in aspen and willow coming back from some of those fires because the soils looked white. They looked really modified by the heat of the fire, and yet we're still seeing quite a bit of sprouting. Do you agree, John?
Yeah, I guess one thing about the riparian is if the land is properly post-fire, then you should grazing and things. They're moist, so.
Yeah, they are moist
so
and productive.
Survival root systems. And if you guys saw, how many people had to sit on Highway 20 and wait for the traffic? I was looking up on Highway 20, heading up like Fraser Creek, and just every day we have to sit and wait for the road because the traffic was down to one lane. You would just sit there and be looking around and seeing all the aspen just growing up along. I guess that was Beaver Creek down there, but I didn't just see it. No, it was free. It just seemed how the aspen was. It's only up 3, 4 feet this summer.
Right, it sure did.
Fire. So, I think he'd also be a great guy to ask.
That's a good question for
He's
Pete.
done a lot of research on fire and riparian versus adjacent companies.
Who's
And
Pete?
Pete Olson, you know Pete?
He's a local fire ecologist, and it'd be good to invite him in when Richie speaks. Let's do that. Yeah. Okay, and then I think I have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
The reversion to grasslands is, how does that play out between bunch grass and cheap?
Areas that already have bunch grass in them will continue to have bunch grass because it's got such it's rooted already and will come back. A lot of the forested areas that have been burned really severely don't have a lot of cheatgrass in them right now, and so that gives them an edge for some native species. But yes, wherever there's more mineral exposure and cheatgrass can spread, you know, pretty well, there will be a little bit more. You know, the fire's going to give it another edge. However, it doesn't have a local seed source in a lot of the forested areas that are burned severely. Yes.
How does aerial reseeding work in this environment for tree seeds?
Oh, I don't know, but I do know that we have the local silviculturist here, so I'm going to just defer to you, John.
The last time that I was in the Forest Service did any seeding was probably the 1970s. Since then, because it's really expensive. And believe it or not, like collecting the seed, once you have that seed collected, cleaned out, it's almost worth its weight in gold. It's really expensive. So, conifer seeding.
You get a lot of rodent response to conifer seeding, especially with ponderosa pine.
Oh, I bet. Alexa, do you want to finish this out?
It's related to that of the Finley Canyon area with the 100% kill. And you mentioned that Doug fir would likely be able to regenerate or be wind blown in better than pea pines. I'm wondering, what about the other potential things blown in, like invaders, like non-natives, that might make it harder for our native trees to pull up again?
I don't think that, I think that that landscape will come back in some grass for sure. And I hate to say this, we do this a lot as ecologists, it really depends. So there might be some seed that survive in the soil because soils are actually quite a good buffer from heat. If there's seeds low enough down, they might survive. And then it really depends on what sort of season we have. Do we have a really moist growing season next year? Could give a foothold for some of the ponderosa pine. However, I expect it to be really kind of spotty regeneration, and it's not going to come back fast. I've not heard of an area that's been covered in forest that's come back really intensely in cheatgrass. That's not what we've seen.
I just think about all those areas have been such important grazing areas for many of the ranchers.
True.
And I know that some ranchers are being excluded from areas for a number of years. Like I've heard that the Bear Creek area will have 5 years of reprieve from grazing, and I'm assuming that's to try to keep, partly at least, to try to keep natives prospering and keep non-natives out from manure and other.
Right. That's a really good question. I wish I had a better answer. I do know that in the Entiat, after fires, annual ryegrass was seeded in to stabilize slopes, and there were cases where it outcompeted tree seedlings. So I know that grass can outcompete, and so sometimes best intentioned seeding of native grasses can even outcompete the pine regeneration. Okay, I need to turn things over. Thanks, you guys.